Roy, director of the NIPFB, in July warned of a silent fiscal crisis. We're now seeing the full-blown effects of it. So has the budget done anything to set us on a path to recovery? What is the recovery timeline looking like? To speak on all this and more, I'm joined now by Mr. Roy. Thank you so much for speaking with me. Now, I saw your take right after the budget, and the sense that I got is you felt a lot more could have been done. Am I reading this correctly?
It's very, very important to remember what I've been saying for the past 3 years, that we have a serious structural problem in the fisc. The government is simply not able to, year after year, collect the taxes that it says it will collect. And the shortfalls are large. So this year, for example, the government was 0.7% of GDP short on its tax collections. The second problem is the government is simply not able to, year after year, disinvest to the extent it wants to disinvest. So what that is doing is it's leaving a big hole in the revenue side. The government then has to scramble to borrow or cut expenditure in the middle of a slowdown to make up for this shortfall. So that structural problem, I think, has not been sufficiently acknowledged. It's not the fault of one government or the other. A consequence of that for your viewers is very simple. You would imagine that the government would borrow to increase expenditure. Well, this year the government has not borrowed to increase expenditure. The entire borrowing of government has gone to make up for the tax shortfall and the disinvestment shortfall. And there was still some shortfall left over and above that. Therefore, actually, the expenditure GDP ratio this year in the revised estimates of financial year 20 are lower than in July. So the government budget has actually contracted, not expanded. That's the problem.
So on the side of revenue is, of course, this big hefty disinvestment target. Do you think Air India being put on the block quite aggressively and the announcement about LIC's IPO would improve that situation?
Yeah, if they meet these unprecedented disinvestment targets, then that would certainly help the situation. But the Secretary of Financial Services has already gone on record this morning saying that the LIC disinvestment will take more than 1 year. Air India, you're not going to get any money for. So I'll have to see the proof of the pudding. The track record of government is that its executive capability to disinvest with political constraints, etc., is low. In the face of that, to set a 2 lakh crore plus target to disinvest is very brave. And I would like to see how this audacity plays out, because the consequences, if it does not, are quite dismal. The government is not expecting to collect more taxes as a proportion of GDP next year. They are planning to borrow less by cutting the on-budget fiscal deficit. Therefore, again, the government budget will shrink if disinvestment doesn't work. And the entire burden of this fiscal plan for 2021 depends on disinvestment working in full measure, not even in partial measure. So I'm worried. I'm willing to trust the government when it says it will, but we've already, 1 day after the budget, ruled out LIC. And I don't know where people think that government is going to make any money out of Air India. What the government will do is stop losing money on Air India. There's no money to be made out of Air India in any significant measure, as you no doubt see when the bids come in.
You know, let me come to, the big number out of, the big macro number out of the budget, which is the fiscal deficit target. We've used the escape clause in the FRBM Act. We've gone to 3.8% this year, 3.5% next year. I must say, government getting kudos for transparency and actually listing its off-budget items this year, so we know what the real situation is. Do you find these targets for fiscal deficit achievable, credible?
Well, the 3.8% is achievable because all the government will do is borrow more and fill the tax hole. The off-budget 0.8 was also there in the budget last year. They just didn't mention it. Last year, they fudged the budget numbers a lot pointlessly. Because actually, Tamanna, last year, as I wrote, the off-budget was available in the budget. All you have to do is look for it. This year, what the finance minister has done very correctly is made it explicit. And it is 0.8%, and most of which is going to fund FCI. Food Corporation of India, that side of things. So it's not particularly counter-recessionary or counter-slowdown. So these targets are eminently achievable unless in April we find in the revised provisional accounts, which come out in April for 2020, that the tax shortfall is even lower than they're saying it is, or the disinvestment shortfall is even lower than they're saying it is, or the indirect tax collections, which are above target, are not actually above target, because then things will be much worse this year, and therefore the distance to climb next year will be that much harder. But on the face of it, yes, they are reasonable.
Okay, let's move forward from the budget. Where, in your view, are we in the economic slowdown cycle? Some say that we have peaked, we can go only up from here. Are there green shoots visible? There's a lot of celebration over PMI numbers for manufacturing that have improved.
You know, there are a lot of astrologers in this country who practice economics clearly, who pick up one data point and then make assertions. I don't do that, but here's my take, without astrology and picking up one data point here and one data point there. The lower your growth rate falls, the more likely it is that you're bottomed out. Our growth rate was 8% 4 years ago, it went down to 7. Now we know that last year it was 6.1 and this year it was 4.8. Any further fall in the growth rate would be a disaster. And therefore I do not think that India is in that kind of disastrous situation. I therefore think that the growth rate will rise, if not in the next 2 quarters, certainly in the next 3 quarters. The key question is by how much it will rise. The way I look at it is this: for this country to grow and secure employment and the participation of its citizens in meaningful economic activity and to improve standards of living, we need to grow at 7% a year on average over 10 years. Next year, if we do not grow at 7%, then the 5-year average growth rate will be below 7% for the past 5 years. Every year we grow at less than 7%, we will therefore be exacerbating the unemployment problem and other problems. We will then be in a situation where we are growing much below our potential on a long-term basis. So the real question for me is not whether we have bottomed out and the growth rate will go back to 6. That is not the question we need to ask. The question we need to ask is, how do we get the growth rate back to 7?
Yeah.
I've at length given my views on this. So therefore, I think the question of whether we are going to sort of stop bottoming out is a facile one, because while we stop bottoming out, and we may well get back to 6% this time next year, do we have a clue of how we'll get back to 7? Certainly not 8, but at least 7. For that, we'd have to understand why we stopped growing now, and I don't think we have satisfactory answers on that.
In fact, exactly what I was coming to. Do you think the government of the day has a clue on how to get back to 7%? Is there a plan, and is there an acknowledgement of the economic situation we're in?
Not yet. But I want to hasten to say that when you have this sort of a problem, it is not just the government who comes up with a plan. I have not heard from industry their take on why the growth rate is slowing. I have not heard from consumers their take on why the growth rate is slowing. If we have a conversation on why the growth rate is slowing, then present options to the government, then perhaps the government can decide what to do and go ahead. At the moment, what we see in the economic survey is sort of something very obvious about wealth creation. We see the economic survey exhorting the government to get out of private business, and we see the economic survey exhorting the government to do business better. I have no problems with these 3 propositions, except they have been true for most of my life, and I'm 52 years old. So there's nothing new here that we are seeing. What we are not seeing, in my personal opinion, my professional opinion, is an acknowledgement, which I'd like to see, that the sources of domestic demand that were powering the economy in the last 18 years have fizzled out. People keep talking about how to revive the auto industry. I want to know how to increase, how to diversify the sources of growth, and how we can get health, education, low-cost housing going, how we can get the textile industry, making for Indians and making for India, rather than importing shirts from Bangladesh and Vietnam. I'm afraid those questions are still not being unasked. We are still looking at the past as a guide to the future. I believe our growth rate will go up to 7 or 8% inclusively, only if we change our pattern and composition of growth. In addition, of course, to improving our export performance, which is highly desirable.
Okay, let me come to the question of improving consumption demand. That was the big ask before this budget. In response, there has been a new range of personal income tax rates, which should be putting more money in the hands of the middle class. Do you think it will help in improving consumption?
Well, on the question of cutting personal income tax rates, what the government has done is offered an alternative regime without exceptions, and we'll have to see how this plays out. So I'm not buying those numbers yet. On the question of consumption, we know that people are consuming less. We need people who work in the consumer space to tell us why people are consuming less. And the answers may be very grim. One answer could be that people are cash flow constrained. The other answer could be that people are employment constrained. The third answer could simply be that consumer demand for things that was growing at a hefty pace for the last 10 years, like airlines, like FMCG, is simply petering out, and people want to spend more on other stuff. They want to change their consumer basket and spend more on things like good health, good education, low-cost housing, and that is simply not happening. Or a fourth answer, which is very worrying, is that our consumption demand is simply leaking out through imports. We don't know which one of these it is. So when I say consumers, I mean we need to study the Indian consumer carefully and understand why that source of demand is petered out. We pay a lot of attention to why export demand is petered out. The other side of exports is consumption, because investment demand is a function of consumption demand and export demand. So that depends on what happens in these two segments. We are not understanding what is happening in the consumer segment well enough. I have theories, I have my own views, but I have not seen these being addressed systematically. As very much like them to. We need a white paper on why we are in the slowdown, and that, I'm afraid, has not yet been forthcoming. And you will notice, in conclusion, that not just is the white paper not forthcoming, the word slowdown was not mentioned in the budget speech even once. So I am worried about this denial in all quarters of the economy, and I really do think we need to stop living in denial and confront the reality.
You know, a big statement over there. We need to stop living in denial. You're asking for a white paper, but why would a government hurt its own political image by acknowledging a slowdown? Do you think that is keeping the government from listing out or laying out the full picture, because it just doesn't go down well with people to say that we're in the middle of a slowdown?
I don't see why it should hurt a government to address a slowdown. And the first step in addressing a slowdown is to acknowledge that one is in a slowdown. I'm certainly not blaming government for the slowdown. I'm not one of those people who simplistically attributes a slowdown to demonetization or GST failures or something like that. They may have contributed to the margin, but the macro reasons why the slowdown is happening are definitely profoundly different. And therefore, I don't really see what political capital the government will lose if it acknowledges the fact of a slowdown. Certain bureaucrats might lose credibility or accountability because they have not brought the slowdown to the Prime Minister's attention soon enough. That's a different matter. But the government does not own the economy. The government is just one part of the economy. So there's really no harm in sort of saying that we are in a slowdown, and these are the things we are going to do to counteract it. We have limited means at our disposal, and therefore it's going to be a long road, but we are going to try. Everything cannot be dressed up in motherhood and apple pie and optimistic statements all the time and permanently, because then what you lose on top of everything else is credibility. So I really do wish that something serious on the slowdown came out from some part of government. It's really not going to be the Chief Economic Advisor. It's really not going to be Niti Aayog. So perhaps the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. But we do need a take on the slowdown that comes from, sort of official circles, and we're not getting it.
Yeah, absolutely. All of the talk of slowdown is now between, conversations like this one. Thank you so much, Rathin Roy, for joining us on the India Development Debate this evening. Rathin Roy, as usual, no holds barred. We'll take a very short break, but when we come back, we're going to talk a little more about that 2 lakh crore rupee disinvestment target, simply because Air India is a big part of that puzzle. And today, a government official has been quoted as saying that the new buyer will not have a free hand to shed excess workforce. Will that throw a spanner in the works? That question and that debate coming up next.